Hello and welcome to the Partnership Project's NVR podcast. This is season 3, episode 9, Peter. My name is Shila Desai.
Hi, and I'm Peter Jakob.
And I think today we've got a really interesting topic, thinking about an addition. I think the last episode was about kind of additions to the current kind of developments in NVR. And I think we have another addition in terms of the needs of the young person that are hidden, that are lost in the kind of battles. And I'm kind of hesitating with using the language of unmet needs. And I wonder, Peter, if you would say a little bit about this topic for us today and for our listeners. Maybe a reminder for our listeners as well of kind of the original thinking and then some of your newer ideas.
Okay, well, I will turn the question on to you in a moment. But I thought it was so beautifully put the way you encapsulated looking at needs as being hidden, obscured, overshadowed, whatever term we want to use, by the battle. So we don't necessarily need to assume that any and every aggressive act is the result of a need which is not articulated or cannot be articulated or is not met. But we can safely assume that the needs are hidden when there is very much conflict and tension, particularly when parents or other caregivers see aggression, hear aggression, feel aggression, or other harmful behaviors. They don't actually see or hear the need, and actually the child's behavior in many ways is threatening or upsetting to them. So it is a struggle to find in themselves attention to these needs, attunement to the child, attunement to what lies behind or is hidden by the problem. And so many years ago, I formulated 3 areas. I did call them unmet need in many children and young people who've had traumatic experiences, who'd experienced abuse, and so forth. But the reason I formulated it as unmet need at the time was that I thought that addressing need becomes interactional, of course. It is not just something in the mind of the young person. And based on experience of working with particularly children in care, but also children in families, in the birth families that were facing many challenges, I no longer use the term multi-stressed families, which is still quite common in systemic work. I sort of identified 4 categories, and I'm aware of the fact that when we identify categories, it's paradigmatic. You know, it's like we say this is a thing. And any further investigation of that, whether it's in research or clinical investigation, it becomes based on those underlying assumptions. And there are 4 that I identified. One being safety and security, which of course encompasses the need to feel safe in relationships, in other words, what attachment theory addresses, but also the need to feel safe from actual physical, sexual, emotional harm, which is addressed in trauma theory. A need for autonomy, which encompasses the ability to make decisions in one's own life, not just the freedom, of course, in an age-appropriate way, not just the freedom, but the ability. the competence that is required, the sense of accomplishment, whether it is in work, studying, play, relationships, all this. And self-determination theory is an area of research that investigates the need for autonomy, but also the prerequisites of autonomy very thoroughly. Then I think, based on Rudy Dallas and Aline Vitteri's work, I became very interested in a third or conceptualizing a third category, which is the need for a coherent narrative of the family and oneself, but one also that on the content level, so not only that shows coherence in terms of a story or narrative structure, but also that is sufficiently benign, in which the child himself also has agency in the story, or in the narrative rather, feels worth being loved, and so forth. And you know, such needs are really the kind of, or such categories of needs are what has sort of organized my thinking, until in a recent conversation you sort of threw up, we were talking about training in child-focused work in NVR, you threw up, and the need for justice. And, you know, for a moment, I felt a bit discombobulated. I thought, oh God, you know, here I have this nice structure and now something new. But I could only have felt discombobulated because somewhere inside I knew that this hits a mark. So I was curious, and here's where I want to put the question back to you. I was curious about how you came to think of that, or how you believe you came to think of that.
I think the idea of justice seeking has become quite a key movement in our therapeutic kind of ideology. You know, some of the therapeutic practitioners, the sort of liberation psychology, the just therapies in New Zealand, some of the justice seeking practitioners in more indigenous communities. And I think what it's kind of awakened in me is this, you know, this kind of what's behind the anger, you know, that what's behind, what is that need that's behind, and that rage, that justified rage, is around a sense of voicelessness, a sense of lack of power, even if you are perceived as an aggressor, that there is under a sense of injustice, and bringing voice to that justice. And I think one of the other things in my practice, in training, in supervision, is seeing very well-meaning practitioners almost being too understanding of suffering. So too understanding of parent suffering, too understanding of trying to get the parent to understand that the child is distressed. And what I think that does is it almost kind of squashes down, suppresses, shuts down what I think is the right for justice, which is, I think, the origin. You know, that's why I love our NVR philosophies, and the roots of those is that activism. So I think that's I think what's been awakened in me. And I'm so pleased that you're thinking of that as another category, and you've been giving that a lot of thought. When I think about some of the different fields in which NVR is being used, thinking about unaccompanied minors, unaccompanied children, and some of the behaviours that are seen as problematic, and that these children have been displaced from their homes. Where is the voice of injustice, or the voice of justice seeking? So I guess that's where I think it comes from. I really appreciate your honing of thinking about the child's need for justice, not the parent's need or the services, but what's that need for the child or the young person.
So you've been inspired both by the increasingly powerful, I'll call it justice discourse in systemic thinking, and by questions around how that connects with the original sociopolitical ideas in NVR and the actual suffering that some of the kids whose families or residential services or foster homes we work with have experienced. Well, what I thought was intriguing when you brought that up was that while it has been a concern of mine for several years, I never named it as a category of need. So the injustice that the child has experienced has been a concern of mine going way back to when I first started working with NVR, because I think NVR has, like most therapies, many elephants in the room. And this, incidentally, is what I'm exploring more and more. What are our own blind spots in NVR? And what are the reasons we have these blind spots? You just said that therapists can be too, what was the word that you used? Understanding. Mm-hmm. I sort of thought at the back of my head, and accepting and perhaps tolerating inadvertently of injustice. And I think something about my clientele, way back when I was working in an area with very high levels of socioeconomic deprivation, struck me as being important. These were kids who grew up in, let's use the word, poverty, who experienced a lot of insecurity in the environment, in the neighborhood, whose schools were not so good, and may have, well, often also experienced a lot of insecurity and often abuse within their families, who'd had many foster placement breakdowns, etc., etc., etc. And I sort of felt, wait a minute, we're looking at the child controlling the parents or carers, rightly so. The child exerting coercive control, often by virtue of their behavior, harming others, and in the process harming themselves, because, of course, it becomes a detriment to their own development. But what about what's happened to these children? And what role does it play? And then I also, much later, you and your colleagues in Birmingham looked at the numbers of children with high ACEs in your referrals for NVR. And I can't remember how many there were, but they were like 40-50%. Very, very staggering high number. So it all just seemed to me to be an injustice, which actually led to the whole idea of child-focused NVR, in conjunction with some dissatisfaction that I felt with some other approaches around that seemed to instrumentalize parents and didn't actually seem to work very well, particularly with kids who were prone to physical aggression and such. But this particular aspect of injustice that the child experienced, I put all that into the category of safety and security. Mm-hmm. My thinking was there needs to be an acknowledgement and maybe other steps, maybe restorative action, maybe reparation of some kind to the child to restore a sense of safety. But ever since your remark, I've been thinking that the need for justice is something different from just the need to feel safe, though perhaps both needs come into play. And I just wonder, what is it that I never formulated the need for justice? What, with such an elephant in the room, I think this is a big elephant in the room of NVR, including in the space in NVR that I've developed. Why was it that I hadn't articulated that or actually conceptualized that when all that social justice discourse, as well in systemic thinking, I'm so familiar with and feel so at home in? So I'm just puzzled.
I guess one of the things, as you're talking, I'm thinking about for practitioners as they're thinking of these different categories, that if we miscue the need as a need for safety and security, and you use the word acknowledgement, then what that does is for practitioners, they may say things like, oh yeah, that's really hard. I'm really sorry that's happened to you. And it was really important that you felt safe and you didn't. That kind of language, that sort of very child-centered. Whereas if we locate the need within a place of justice for the young person, the way that we will interact, because you talked about that kind of interaction as a way of moving towards, to change. Our interactions with the young person would be, what do we need to do about this? What is it that's important that you're able to say or do? And as you were describing this sort of blind spot, I was thinking of a young person that I've been working with who was in a residential unit. He was living in a residential home, and he was, he trashed the place. He was dismissive to staff. He would go out and nobody would know where he was. And we were working with some of those within a kind of the residential staff, raising their presence. But what in the work I was doing with this young lad, one of the things that he was saying was, when I was unwell, when I injured myself and I couldn't look after myself, and I came out of hospital and I came back, they didn't welcome me properly. And that's why I threw this and that and the other. He didn't put the two together, but we were able to. Now, if I had said, oh, I'm really sorry, oh, that's really horrible. Oh, no, what you needed was X, Y, and Z. You needed them to look after you. You needed them to notice, which is within the safety. But, I saw that. And I didn't realise it at the time, but I saw it within the category of justice and really worked with this young boy. Coaching, we did a lot of walking, not in a room, walking together, coaching him to imagine the kind of conversation he would need to have with one of the staff members about that moment when he wasn't welcomed. What was that like for him? And he was able to speak to that staff member with me witnessing and just kind of touching his knee and sort of saying, come on, you can do this. When he would look at me to fill in the gaps, I'd be like, no, this is yours. And that made such a difference to that relationship with that staff member.
And of course, you became that young man's NVR coach in that work, because in NVR, we don't place as much importance on the therapist-client relationship as we do on relationships in the ecological environment of the client, and we become facilitators. We're decentered much more, aren't we?
Yeah.
I remember one time I did a seminar for students on narrative therapy, and I talked about, I messed up the whole seminar because I told the students that we're not really important. that in clients' lives, and that, when we've done our work, they say, thank you, it was great, lovely, goodbye, farewell, hope never to see you again. And that our role often, at least from the point of view of systemic work, is to, from a more decentered position, to facilitate those changes in the natural environment. And I guess also, often in NVR, we don't actually see the young person. So it becomes our task to, I think, invite the adult to initiate a process of justice. And I think what you've also indicated, I think you said what he would like to hear or needs to hear from the staff, a particular member of staff. And ultimately, he told that member of staff, in other words, well, one word there could be, he challenged the member of staff to take a different position. And I'm thinking of, well, the word that came to my mind, and this is a difficult word because it becomes so much a question of our ethics, doesn't it? The word that came to my mind was should. If we're looking at justice, what do you feel that member of staff should do? And I'm currently reading up about I'm reading up on different justice theories, and I've come across someone whose work I really love called Iris Marion Young, who was a political philosopher, an ethicist, and I thought I made a distinction, but she made that, of course, and elaborated and developed it 30 years before. So much for thinking that an original thought. The distinction is between accountability and responsibility. Accountability, if we have too much stress on accountability, we become, perhaps we run the risk of becoming punitive. In NVR, what we often look for is responsibility. What does your responsibility look? But then reading Iris Marion Young, I sort of stumbled over the fact that that need for justice can also mean an accountability for past failures. But can we, as therapists, hold, for example, parents or members of staff, as in this example, other caregivers, can we hold them accountable? Is that our job? But then I was thinking, well, what do we do in child-focused NVR often? And what we do, I guess, is invite them to hold themselves accountable for past omissions or failures, or just, things in the past that the child struggled with, as as their ongoing forward-looking responsibility. It's part of my responsibility to hold myself accountable towards the child and others publicly, and to change my behavior, to make a true commitment to change my behavior from here on in. And I guess there are many practical examples of that. I'm working with a father in individual therapy currently, who came to the attention of the local authority and the police after an assault on his daughter in an altercation. And part of our work has been the use of a self-announcement, which he's distributed to family members. And the core part of the self-announcement is an acknowledgement of past behaviors of his that have been harmful, and a commitment from here on in not to try to change, but to change. Commitments to try to change are not commitments. So I'm still struck by the fact that I've worked with using self-announcements in such a way over the years so many times, but I still never articulated the child's need for justice. When actually this is not just safety doing, this is, in the words of Vicki Reynolds, this is justice doing in NVR, isn't it?
Mm. And I think, I know you're quite perplexed by this idea of the elephant in the room. And I think perhaps the elephant in the room is that the justice has always been there, weaved into all the other categories.
Yeah.
So it is, and that our conversation and what you've been thinking about, Peter, is uncoupling that and giving it its own space. And I really liked. I mean, we often don't talk about failures because we're so often preoccupied towards solution.
Yes. We
And I know
don't want
Tom
to use the F word, the W word.
And I was always struck by something Tom Anderson said, which is sometimes we have to go through the dark tunnel with some and not just look towards the light. And I think that idea of accountability of past failures that you describe, with us doing that with that real compassion to the adults' past failures, the system's past failures, and how to that commitment to the child or to other important people in their lives to help them to not repeat that. Actually, what I'm thinking is for the kid. I mean, we could be saving years of therapy here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, this is one of the central tenets of systemic work, as I've learned it, is that if we can find something that is pivotal and brings about a transformative, in Carl Tom's words, or ultimately healing interpersonal pattern, then things can move very powerfully in a helpful direction. And yes, someone doesn't have to spend 27 years in therapy. Absolutely.
Peter, this has been such a rich conversation. I'm so pleased that you've added this category, and I think it's going to have a really profound effect for our practitioners and for our training as well, because we have a lot of practitioners who view NVR as quite weaponizing towards children. I use that word purposefully, and I think this real connection with justice seeking for our children and that accountability for the adults will really, I think, serve. Is there any final words, you, Peter, around this that you want to say?
Well, I was just thinking you sound a bit like Melvin Bragg. So in our time, is there anything else that you would have
I
liked
just
to?
wanted to make sure that we
Yeah.
give this time, but I'm also don't want to make it.
Well, there is one thing I'm still puzzling over. Where, and you said the elephant in the room. I'm actually interested in the plural of that, elephants. I think the room is full of elephants. Um, so I'm thinking, what were the inhibitions that initially led to many people, and still do, struggling with the adoption of NVR? And I think that it is the action orientation of NVR, the fact that it is not child-centered. Jim Wilson, from whom I took on the idea, was inspired by, for the idea of a child focus. That's different from a child-centeredness, which places the child and what the child says and does at the center of all or most of our thinking. But I think, the way we've been socialized as therapists has sort of made us often reluctant to take relational risks in therapy, but not just between ourselves and our clients, but in the field out there, in the clients' lives out there. So I think too often we've seen therapy as happening in the therapy room, not in that whole area outside of it. And I think something similar may be at play with the idea around justice happening, again, not just in the therapy room, not just with me as a therapist, as a witness of the injustice that was done to a child, or ultimately also a parent, and that's another, there are many elephants there as well. But I think we sort of shy away sometimes from these things. I think it's sometimes difficult, and we worry about moving out of positions of neutrality, when sometimes we've got to be clear. And there is an ethical line in the sand to be drawn.
I think that sounds like a really a clear point to end this conversation, or to end, but open up, I think, future conversations around these elephants in the room. Thank you so much, Peter, for sharing this. I think it's going to add a huge amount to the field again. So thank you very much. And I'll just say goodbye from me for now.